React Server components have been the hot topic of conversations in most of JavaScript and web development world. Everywhere from Twitter to YouTube to conference talks to blog posts, people have been either really excited or really skeptical of React Server components. Personally, I've been in the skeptical zone for a while, but after looking at it with fresh eyes and exploring the possibilities a bit, I think I've fully switched over to the very excited school, and I'm going to talk about why in this video. I know some of you are probably already tuning out at this point and saying, if I really need to understand 20 Dan Abramov Twitter threads before I can really get React Server components, what's the point? It's too complex, right? I'm not gonna sit here and say that I got it right away or that it didn't take me a lot of reading or watching conference talks, reading Twitter threads to really understand what React Server components are about. It did, but there are some very valid reasons for this. First of all, so much of the conversations around React Server components have been wrapped around things like data fetching, caching, monkey patching, suspense, progressive hydration, routing, nested layouts, actions, compiler hacks, running a server, and whatnot. It's been very difficult to talk about just React Server components. Stuff like the Next.js app router, Vercel hiring React core team members, or just the vibe that React is giving off these days. All of this has us distracted from the very core idea and the impact of React Server components, which is a paradigm shift in how we think about our applications. For a long time, the divide between the server and the client has dictated the divide between data and UI, or between front end and back end. We have always tied the two of these concepts together. Our UI and backend logic were always treated as completely separate and lived in completely separate repositories, even worked on by completely separate teams. But if you look at the history of full stack development, you'll notice that we have been craving for this gap to get smaller and smaller. I was a PHP developer before I went all into JavaScript, and I'm sure a lot of you have done some PHP or even looked at some PHP code and thought, wow, this is very nice, but it will never scale. And yet, full stack development found a way. It started with Node.js and things like the Mean or the Mern stack or Meteor.js, and we were finally able to use the same programming language on both ends, but the divide was still there. Then we got things like GraphQL that shifted a lot of the data fetching responsibilities from the backend to the front end and brought them a little closer together, but the divide was still there. Then we got Next.js that brought the two into the same project, but the divide was still there. Libraries like Blitz and TRPC completely eliminated the API layer, but the gap, guess what, was still there. React Server components obliterates this gap. It gives us a way to completely decouple the client-server divide from the front-end back-end divide. This is such a powerful paradigm that entire categories of problems simply cease to exist. Next.js came to this realization a while ago and basically gutted itself to make room for React Server components. So many of these tools that made this client-server separation easier to handle are now going through an identity crisis because 80% of the problems that they solve no longer exist. And this is because of one simple idea, that your front end is just a function on your server. It's not a special component that magically receives data from another special data fetching function that is also rendered on the server, so you have to be careful about how you import things, what you import in there, how you use variables, none of that. Yeah, I know use client is a thing, stop screaming, I'll talk about that later. The main idea is that your UI is a first-class citizen on your server. Now, this is not just speculation. If you doubt that this paradigm shift is so massive, or that React can even achieve something like it, allow me to loop you into a little secret. React has already done it once before. Remember the times when the separation between HTML and JavaScript used to dictate the separation between our UI and our logic? Remember when we not only had to put them into separate files with separate extensions, but also in entirely different folders? Remember how we struggled with templating languages that kept on adding feature over feature and basically created a whole new programming language that we had to learn? We clutched on to this idea of separation of concerns so hard because that was the status quo. Then React came along and showed us how dumb that was by making UI a first-class citizen of your JavaScript code. We were very skeptical of that in the beginning as well, but once we started to embrace it, Well, the rest is history. React didn't explode in popularity because it was fast or lightweight or had a VDOM or because Facebook was backing it. Sure, those are the reasons you'll see in blog posts that you'll hear in team meetings or refactoring sessions. But the key was JSX, or UI as first-class citizen of your code. My point is, breaking down the barrier between data and UI is not new to us. It's certainly not new to React. We have seen the power that comes with JSX. It allowed us to build components that encapsulated features or entire portions of our applications instead of just behavior and UI. You can build a fully playable board of chess, package it into a component, and ship it, and all I have to do is to import it and add one single line of code to my application. And now React is extending this capability of slicing our code by feature all the way up to the server. So not only can you just build a chessboard, you can build a fully featured multiplayer game of chess that two people can log into and play against each other and ship it as a React component that I can just add into my application with a single line of code. I can build all the features of my application separately into these vertical slices that all just export one React component that I can then compose into my full application, simply because I'm able to put my front end and back end together into the same component. Now, I want to be clear. Putting the backend and front end together like this is not easy. There are so many design and implementation challenges that have to be solved before we get there. Being able to build an application with React Server components is a challenge in itself. This is why so much of the React core team has switched from Meta to Vercel, because Vercel has the same goal of putting the front end and back end together. But just like how Next.js decided to rip out its own implementation in order to accommodate server components, React cannot just spend all of its time iterating on server components. It has to help Next.js implement server components into their own patterns, which means stuff like file system routing and nested layouts and data caching and bundle optimization are now concerns that React also has to think about. If we want to use React server components today, we have to accept how Next.js wants us to use them, because they have had a huge head start in implementing it. It's going to be a while before server components are just available to us without the patterns or opinions of any meta framework wrapped around it. And we are going to see the true power of server components the closer we get to this milestone. But until then, server components is an unfinished product. I wouldn't even say it's bleeding edge yet, just because there are so many ways to use React server components that are not available to us. So if you feel like there's too much going on, that you have to carefully understand everything that Dan Abramov has to say before you can really understand React server components, that's fine. You can just sit it out, you can wait. These conversations on Twitter are not Dan Abramov explaining how server components work. It's him experimenting with ideas and asking for our feedback. This is what happens when someone is working on any new piece of technology. We don't always see it because it usually happens privately in Discord channels or random meetings or secret underground meetups during conferences. It doesn't always happen out in the open, like it's happening with server components. We are seeing how the sausage is made now, but the sausage factories have always been there, just behind closed doors. You're not missing out on server components by not being a part of these conversations. However, if you are as excited about the future of server components as I am, you can contribute to it by being a part of these conversations, by experimenting with these patterns, by exploring the possibilities. The reason why all of this is happening in public is because React no longer has thousands of highly skilled front-end engineers that are playing and experimenting with their patterns at a very large company. Facebook used to be their ground zero for experimentation, but that's no longer the case with server components, and Vercel's top priority right now is to make money and not go bankrupt. Earlier this month, Theo kicked off Reactathon by saying server components need our help, and he's absolutely right. Highly recommend you go watch his take on this as well. I really hope I was able to get you at least slightly excited about React server components, because I really need server components to happen as fast as possible. And every single person who contributes with their thoughts and experiments brings us closer to that future. Just as every single person who hits the like and subscribe buttons brings me closer to 5,000 subs.